Hey friends, welcome back. So today I'm going to do a review on the Verve skates. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the things that I like about these skates, things that I maybe didn't like or maybe didn't prefer, give you my final thoughts, and then tell you who I think this skate is best for. If you're not familiar with Echo, they are fairly new to the aggressive market. They were formerly Anarchy Skates, which falls under an umbrella of like a bigger extreme sports organization. And they premiered these skates, the prototypes anyway, at Winter Clash 2024 with the final skates that launched middle to late summer last year, just depending on where you were based at and had access to the skates. So these come about 250 US dollars for the full setup, which includes liner, shell, sole plate, frames, wheels, anti-rockers. It is a raised heel skate, and one thing that's interesting is the plastics on this are made from recycled material. And I've been riding them for 3 months. I got them as a gift for Christmas, and I'm no longer able to ride them, and I will get into the specifics later in this video, but that's why I'm doing this review shorter than my typical like 6 month long term, is because these skates didn't last me 6 months. So let's talk about the wheels. The wheels that come stock on the skates are a 60 millimeter 90A wheel. And my experience with them is that the wheels lasted me a session and a half before they cored and I wasn't able to use them. I never have the best of luck with stock wheels. I think that they shred really easy and, they just don't last for the way that I skate. So 1.5 sessions, it's pretty short. So if you're a newcomer to the sport, you may get a little longer life out of these wheels. But I would just recommend that you have a good quality backup wheel just in case. So throw that down. So, let's talk about the anti-rockers real quick. So it does come with Echo anti-rockers. And if you look at the profile on them, they are very similar to the Dead profile. So they have the tapers on both sides and then they have like the little ribs. They claim that these are, the 100A durometer. But honestly, when I skated them, I felt like they were slowing me down because they were like creating friction on ledges. So I typically swap them out with the Dead anti-rockers, and then, that problem went away. So that does tell me that was, probably a little softer anti-rocker than, what I personally like. But, I'm able to kind of pick up on those things as I skate. The wheels do come with an ABEX 7 bearing, which is a decent bearing, for a skate. It's not the highest precision quality, and it's definitely not the lowest. So a lot of people can't really tell the differences between ABEX, but the reality is like the higher the ABEX rating, the higher the manufacturing tolerance, means that you have a lot of parts that fit a lot more snug and tighter together, so you just end up with like a little more quality. And I tend to notice that through my skating, just because I go through so many bearings. So the frames that came stock on the skate for my foot size was 250 millimeter wheel spacing. And, I liked the nice wide H block. A lot of people have compared them to Create Originals. And I would say that there definitely is some similarities to Create Originals, but I would say that these frames are probably a lot sturdier. I'd say it's honestly like if Create Originals and the Them frame had a baby. And it's because it has like the really thick plastic, the cross bridging, and it's just really beefy and blocky type frame. I found that they slid really well, and that, when I was breaking them in, they grooved in and worn in really quickly. But then after they grooved in, they really haven't seen like a lot of excessive wear. And I'll be honest, like my first few sessions, I was looking at how much wear they had, and I was like, oh man, are these frames going to last me? But yeah, they held up fine. Let's see. I thought that they slid well. I skated them on various ledges, rails. Didn't really have a problem with them sticking. And, the hardware that comes with them, so the frame bolts and axle bolts, those were both really high quality as well. So let's talk about the things that I maybe didn't like or maybe didn't prefer. The first being the wheel spacing. So with these being a 250 millimeter wheel spacing that comes on the 41-42 skate, I personally felt like it was a little short for me. And, ideally you want the center of the wheel to be more in line with the end of the shell and, near the heel. And the reason for that is because that gives you the most stability, because otherwise your wheel is behind the end of the toe or in front of the end of your heel. So when you land, you feel like you're either going to slip forward or you're going to slip back. So having that, for me, the sweet spot is about a 260 millimeter wheel spacing. And that just gives you that extra balance on the frame. And, that really goes a long way. So I think this frame is probably a little short for this skate, in my size anyway. Another comment is I think this has to do with the plastic that they use, because they use recycled materials. And I feel like that plastic has to be really thick in order to be sturdy. So, what they do is they have like a lot of plastic, making those sidewalls thicker. It's a really thick, dense H block. And then it's a lot of cross bridging, which is fine, but it adds weight to the skate. But also, it's not the widest sole plate, so it eats up a little bit of room on that sole plate too. And that just makes, hitting top sides on ledges just a little more challenging, but still doable. So let's talk about the things that I like about the liner. So I thought it was a really comfortable liner, and it fits the skate like really well, and to the point where it's like hard to find another liner that actually fits the shell the same way that this does. And I'll get into the details on why I had to change liners here in a few minutes. But yeah, it's super comfortable, fits the shell really well, and it's basically like really padded around the ankle area, but not so thick that it's going to like pack in a lot over time. And then, you've got a pretty thin forefoot area, which, you typically use these kind of liners when you're downsizing. So it almost comes in a like downsized configuration, which could be good or could be bad depending on, you as a person and what you're looking for in a skate. One thing I like too is that it comes with these Velcro pads. I'm going to call them pads. And, basically what you do is you put it anywhere you're having a pressure point, and that's supposed to help, just create like an additional buffer so you don't get pressure. I typically use these at the cuff bolt areas because it's this thick block of metal. And so it just never hurts to have some additional padding there, just to prevent pressure points from happening on your ankle bones, because that takes a long time to heal if you do bruise your ankles. Another thing that I liked was the carry straps. They're nice, wide, open. It's just really easy to grab the skates and go. All right, so here's where the liners fell short for me. So, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting is, and I almost wonder, looking back on it, I almost wonder if they didn't create their sizing charts as kind of an afterthought. But I'm a 275 Mondo. The skate says that this goes up to like exactly a 275, but I had to take off this reinforcing on the back just to get my foot to fit in there, because otherwise it was pushing my toe into the end of the shell. So, these additional reinforcings are supposed to be there because usually it means that the liner doesn't have enough support, which is fine. But it just means like, okay, well, if the intent is to have this, then just make the shell like a couple millimeters longer to account for this. Because, and the reason for that is because one thing I noticed is when I was like putting on my skates, you put your ankle in and it like buckles, without this. It was just causing this to kind of buckle and crunch up in the shell. And so I had to like pull it up, every time that I put my foot on. And honestly, it may not be like this part. This part is the stiffest. It's this down here, which is the thinnest. And that's kind of where it's buckling, which this really doesn't do anything for. Talk about the insole. So I was not a fan of this insole. I understand, that this is probably a cost-saving measure to make the skate more affordable. But, it looks like it has rebounded some. But, I skated for like an hour my first session, and these things had completely flattened out where they were like thin as pancakes. And, I can barely put any pressure on it and feel my fingertips through it, which means that these are really ineffective at providing any kind of support or shock absorption. So next, the heel pad. So this is very similar to how Intuition does their heel pads. So like my fit, they'll run the heel pad to about the middle of the foot, and it's made out of kind of this like harder, denser foam, whereas Intuition is kind of like this softer open cell foam. But this insole or this shock absorber is so soft that it doesn't do anything. So it's just kind of a waste. But also putting in a wedge like this on top of a pretty aggressive raised heel skate, picks your foot up, and it adds to just that imbalanced feeling that I had on these skates. But yeah, so I mentioned that I couldn't get these stock liners to work. And, a big reason for that was because of this elastic toe. So I was at the very end of the shell size, and it was weird too because the insole is actually shorter than my foot, even though my foot is a 275. So why would you make a liner that goes up to 275 if the insole doesn't even cover the length of your foot? Because then your toes are like rubbing against the edge of that insole, and it's such a weird feeling as like you're trying to skate and you feel that like gap between the edge of the insole and the end of the liner, and it's all you can think about while rolling around. But anyway, I mean, that's a side note. I'm not a fan of elastic toes in skates. I honestly think it's a trend that needs to go away, and I think there needs to be more creative ideas on how to fill the gap at the end of the liner, maybe from the inside, that pads it out versus, having something so flexible. Because the problem is, as you land, your foot has a tendency to spread out, and when it spreads out, having something so soft and elastic is going to allow your foot to slide forward, and then you slam it into the end of the skate. And it's one of the worst feelings ever, especially, if you're riding a skate that doesn't have a lot of extra room between the end of the liner and the shell, which, is this skate. And, that's probably more me because I'm at the top end of the shell size, but I fall within their sizing chart. So for me, that was a pretty obnoxious thing that I had to deal with. And So I had to end up going on a quest and basically digging through every single liner that I own to see what would fit best in this. And I went through like the MyFit Prime liner, the MyFit Second Skin, Intuition liners, the Rollerblade Blank liner, the Rollerblade Nomad liner, and then the Mesmer TS3 liner. And I found that the Mesmer TS3 liner actually fit the best because it had, very similar cuff and very similar forefoot but padded toes. And then, it had a stock insole in there, so that helped fill some of the volume in the shell. And then, in addition to that, I had to add some additional like shock absorption under. So, I got two different things to work. So I got the Rect insole, which I did a whole review on it a few weeks back. And, that's basically like a raised heel insole that fits under the liner. You could put it inside the liner. And then I used a combination of, what was it, the dead shock absorber and then the footprint shock absorber. But together, those equaled about the thickness of the Rect insole and the heel. But again, that's a lot more material you're adding to the heel to raise it up just to create some shock absorption. Yeah, so that's basically my thoughts on the liner. And then, one thing too is that, this tongue was kind of floppy. It's always nice if you have like something in here to kind of like when you lace it up, it holds the tongue in place. And I found that this did move around a little bit. And, even though that this is pretty squishy, I didn't find that it really like was banging into the buckle or causing pressure points, other than, it is just a little more on the flimsy side. But, I just wish these liners worked out for me a little better. So let's talk about the shells real quick and what I liked about them. One thing that was really surprising is that the shells are actually fairly wide. So they're pretty wide, all through the sides and in the toe box. And then it does have quite a bit of height volume, if you do have a high volume foot. So that I thought was really nice. I thought the buckles, they were fine. I didn't really have any issues with it. I really liked the buckle protector for the buckles. The Echoes, they have this really, I don't know, I wouldn't call it revolutionary, but I would say it's a unique approach to to address cuff adjustment. And it's basically this contraption that has a metal block on the metal block on the inside, cuff bolt on the outside. You unbolt it, and then you're able to move it into three different height settings based on your preference. And then, And then for the sole plates, they attach to the boot with this X-bracing configuration. And I thought that was a very solid assembly. I did think it was a little weird because, like, when you look at the receptor on the underside, the receptor does kind of move a little bit. So that means the frame has a potential to move like a little bit independently of the sole plates. But yeah, this is one of those skates where it's like sole plate mounts or frame mounts to the sole plate, and then the sole plate mounts to the boot. And I've always found that, the most secure skate is where you mount the frame to the boot and then everything just gets sandwiched together. Not by just the frame bolts, but, if you use combination of frame bolts and then the sole plate hardware, that's like chef's kiss. Let's see. Yeah, hardware was solid, good quality. I thought the sole plates, they, slid really well. They did feel a little slower at first on like metal surfaces, so like copings, metal coping ledges, angle iron ledges. But I think it was just the plastic surfacing on these that you just had to wear off, and then from there on out, like they slid fine. Like not the fastest, not the slowest. Like they were honestly in the middle and worked pretty well for me. And then yeah, as far as fit goes on these, so like I said, I'm a Mondo 275, and their sizing chart is weird because like you go to anybody who sells these, and all they do is give you like a UK number, for the skates. So like for these, they'll say like 41, 42, but they don't actually include a size chart on what that mean. What? Yeah, they don't include a size chart that converts to what shell size is appropriate for your foot length. You have to kind of take a guess or know where to find that information. So I'll talk about that too in a minute. So, but my foot 275, and I felt that it was really the appropriate length once I changed liners. But in the stock liner, it felt like it was small just because my issue with my foot kind of sliding forward because of that neoprene toe. But yeah, once I changed the liner, it felt perfect. So I would recommend just following their sizing chart to a T. And yeah, I think that kind of addresses all the things I liked about the shell. So one thing I forgot to mention was where to find the size chart. So like I mentioned in the video, all the retailers just show a UK, EU shell sizing. So it's like 41, 42, but they don't actually say what Mondo foot length corresponds to the shell size. So how you find that is you have to go to the Echo Instagram, dig all the way down to their reels, and then they have, an updated sizing chart that tells you what your Mondo is versus the recommended shell size. And then, it has some additional information too, but that's where you find the info. All right, so let's talk about the things that I didn't necessarily like about the skates or the shell. And the first being is that, the sole plate, like I feel like it's a medium width sole plate, but it's definitely not the widest sole plate. And, when you combine the sole plate width with the plastic that they used, so out of the box, this is not a flexi skate. It honestly reminded me a little bit of like the first version of like the FR UFRs, where you had to kind of compensate with like leaving your buckles more open just to be able to get like the skate to torque over versus flexible plastics that allow you to torque the plastic to be able to like slide into positions. And so for me, like the plastic, it took a couple months for it to break in and even be flexible. And if you watch like my first couple sessions, I can always tell like how flexy a skate is by how easy it is for me to do like top porns and sweat stances on ledges. And I couldn't, my first session on these, I could not for the life of me land like a top porn. It was like that stiff, and I was able to get them broken in, to a point where it was like, pretty easy for me to do, which means the plastic does soften up over time, but it's not out of the box flexy. And that could be okay with certain people, and that could be not okay with certain people, but I want to be transparent about it. Um, So one thing too is that when you look at, the plastic stiffness with the narrower H block or narrower sole plate, if you're using like a frame that has a taller H block, so basically, if you're using flat frames, a lot of times the H block sits further away from the bottom of the sole plate. That is really hard to get boot down. And even like with an anti-rocker frame, I was struggling to get boot down on like back Farves and Royales. And, that combined with like the top porns, like, those are kind of my safety tricks. And like, if it's hard for me to get boot down on those, like, I can only be so flexible just because of like an old knee injury. But, that's pretty telling with like how stiff a skate is. I know I'm kind of rambling about that, but I hope all of this makes sense and, is clear because I'm trying to be as transparent as possible. Another thing that, I noticed is this is, because it's a raised heel boot, that always means that the heels are a lot thicker on sole plates, but the plastic that they use is very, very thick. And this goes back to what I was saying about the frames, is that I feel like they have to use a lot of plastic because of the type of plastic they're using. And that just makes all of the weight in this skate concentrated at the very bottom of the boot. So, like the sole plates are, really heavy. Or the frames add a lot of weight, but the upper portion, like this, doesn't weigh a lot. Like, the plastic is somewhat thick, but all the weight is in this bottom half. I also felt that, this X hardware, I don't know if you can see that, just make sure I don't cover up the microphone. But, this X hardware has so much surface area, it basically covers, I would say probably half of the skate when you look at the inside of it. And it goes from wall to wall, at the heel, wall to wall at the toe. And with how hard the frames are, that metal, and then how poor the shock absorption is, it's just a conduit for all of that energy shooting up into, my knees. And that's one thing I'm very sensitive to, is just a lot of shock. And, I feel like these skates are not very good at resolving shock. So all of that just made it very painful, like the first few sessions, until I was able to find a combination that worked for me. But it was like a little bit of a frustration. Like, I'm not going to lie. Like, I was almost ready to give up after just a few sessions. And the only reason that I hung on to these is because they were a Christmas gift. But I was like, when I was say I was frustrated, like, I mean, I was very, very frustrated with trying to find something to work in these. So I don't know, take that for what it's worth. Let's see. Yeah, and then another thing that was interesting too is, so even though I switched out the liner, it I had to add, like one additional shock absorber. I had the liner. I had an additional insole in there, and I still felt like, I had some room where my foot was kind of floating around, and because of like how stiff these skates were, it was just really hard to get them cinched up and laced where they actually like locked my foot down. So, that was a little frustrating as well. And it kind of makes me feel like, well, skate may be better with like a 45 strap. And then, yeah, and then, another thing is just with, the shock absorption to put in there, it raises the heel even more. So it's a very, very aggressive heel raise. And that just added to, the imbalance I was feeling while skating these. But, let's get on to why I can't skate these anymore. So I went out to skate yesterday. It was like 70 degrees, beautiful, sunny Denver day. Took off work early, and I was just like, I'm going to go crush the skate park before all the kids get out of school. I get there, I lace it up, pop out of, quarter pipe a couple times, look down, and I fractured my skate. And I don't know if you can see that, but it's right here at the toe. And I know why that happened is because this toe is very stiff. And then when you get to the sides, you have a little more flex in it. So as, I pull in the laces, you end up with a lot of stress at this kind of re-entrant corner, and that just caused it to shear. And I think that has something to do with it being like a really stiff plastic that they're trying to, I don't know, they're trying to use like a thinner version of a stiff plastic, but at the end of the day, I get the feeling that's kind of brittle. And my understanding is that, a lot of people have issues, and maybe not a lot, maybe few, and maybe I've only heard about, it from them, but they've had problems with it cracking in cold weather, which kind of makes sense because, the skates get cold, everything hardens, more prone to cracking. But seeing something crack when it's warm outside, and it's not like I left these skates in my car where they got too hot. Like I literally took them from my house, put it in my car, drove 5 minutes to my skate park, put them on, and then they cracked. So, that's kind of frustrating. And, honestly, like given the history with trying to resolve the shock absorber, trying to resolve the liner, and then seeing that these shells cracked is honestly very frustrating for me, especially since I've put in 3 months of trying to break these in to get them the flex that I need. And now, I just filed a warranty claim with Echo. I don't know what they're going to do about that, but, if they replace the shell, that means I'm starting over with a very stiff shell that basically got to go 3 months again of breaking in. And I just don't know if I have the energy for that. So that is a lot of information, but also a lot of things to consider based on my experience with the skate. All right, so let's talk final thoughts on these. I think that they are a nice wide skate at an affordable price. It is the first version of the skate, and I didn't expect that they would be free of imperfections or defects. Like, I've never skated a perfect skate. I don't know that a perfect skate exists. What you want is a skate that checks most of the boxes and is enjoyable to skate. And for me, these skates had a lot of frustrations. I mean, I had frustrations with the liner in my toe slamming into the skate. I had shock absorption issues. The skate was stiffer than I expected, and took a while to break in. But I finally got there, and then as soon as I got it mostly dialed in, it cracked on me, and I can't skate it anymore. And even if I get replacement shells from Echo, I got to go through the whole damn process again of breaking in the shells, and I don't know if I want to go through that. So I'm really torn on this, and I just wanted to be as transparent as possible with my experience. And I'm not saying buy them or don't buy them. I just want to provide you guys the information so you can make the decisions yourselves. And what I hope is that they take feedback, they make improvements, and continue to be a really good skate company. That right there is like the marks of a good company is, can you take feedback? Can you make adjustments and make it better for the people who are buying it? Because if you don't, the skate's not going to last very long. The company is not going to last very long because people don't want to spend money on something that's not going to work. So with that being said, I talked to Echo at Winter Clash, and they mentioned they saw my video, with my first sessions, and apparently they had received some other feedback about the shock absorbers and about the toe hitting the skate, which drove some changes that they're working on for the next release. So, what they mentioned is like, the liner, they're, putting a better toe cap in where it's cushioned. They're improving the shock absorbers on it. The only thing that I don't know if they're improving or not is the plastics based on the feedback of, cracks. And I know I'm not the only one who had an issue with cracking, because some people have experienced cracking in the cold. Some people experienced cracking when it was warm, similar to me. But, I really do hope they take the feedback. My understanding is that they heard the feedback that people wanted a 260 millimeter frame, so they made a 260 millimeter frame. Hopefully that makes it on the next version of skate releases, where, that frame kind of bridges the foot shells between, 250 and 270. So I'm really optimistic for that. And, I could see that this is a skate that I come back to in the future, but I don't think it's a skate that I come back to immediately. Like, I had a decent experience with it. I had a lot of frustrations, and I'm in a wait and see what they do about it mode. So, who is this skate best for? Honestly, this skate is going to be best for someone who needs a wide and supportive skate at a good price point. And, knowing that you may have to make some changes, modifications to get it to work for you. I don't know how many people out there exist. Seems like a lot of people love this skate. Maybe I'm just the one off and I'm an outlier. I don't know. But in my opinion, that's who I think the skate is best for. So, who is this skate not for? Honestly, I think this skate is probably not for someone who is expecting a really flexy skate out of the box. I think you're going to find it too stiff, too flexy. You may not have the patience to break it in, and the skate may not be for you. Alternatively, if you've got a very low volume foot, you may have a similar experience to me, where it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of energy into trying to figure out how to fill the volume in the shell to make it work for you. And that could be like if you've got a very flat foot, very skinny ankles, if you've got a narrow foot. Just keep that in mind if this is a skate that you're looking for. All right, well, I threw a lot at you. I had a lot of strong opinions. I had a very mixed experience on these skates. And I would say that this has been one of the hardest reviews that I've had to make, because I want to be fair to Echo. I don't want to over criticize. But at the end of the day, part of what I want to do with my channel is be transparent with my experience skating stuff. I bought these, my family paid money for these, and, I'm not biased. I don't have anything against Echo. What I try to look for is, how do these skate? Did I have a good time on them? And if not, what caused me not to have a good time? And is there anything that I would recommend to improve to make these more enjoyable, like in the potential future, or for other people looking to buy these? So, not trying to pick on anyone, not trying to beat anyone up, and trying to be fully transparent, what my experience was. But if you've skated these or you have questions about these, feel free to drop me a comment, and I'd be happy to, touch base with you. So with that being said, thanks all for checking in, and we'll catch you next time.